Welcome to the Bildner Center panel, or I should say talk, on the evolution of inequality in Brazil. We'll see about the evolution because I was just reading something by our speaker, Marcelo Medeiros, who's an economist from the University of Brasilia, who's spending this year at Princeton University. So we have him as a neighbor here, and so you can come more often, I hope. Some of his recent work pointed to the stability of inequality. That, in other words, it's not getting better at any rate. So he will discuss the evolution of it with us, after which we will take questions. So I won't talk much more than this. Some of you are old friends. I told some of you at the beginning, I'm just getting over by a few hours a bad cold. So I'm not giving anybody an abrazo today, but you have my abrazos like that anyway. So Marcelo, you are on now.
Okay, thank you. All right. Before I begin anything, I would like to thank the Bildner Center and the invitation, and I would like to thank Kenneth for accepting being my moderator / discussant. Before I would like to speak about the evolution of inequality in Brazil over almost a century, and maybe I should start by saying that even though I'm very confident about the results in terms of the trends of inequality, I would say that I have more questions than answers regarding the causes of these trends. We know very well how the inequality has been going up and down over the years. We don't know exactly why it's going up and down. So if I mention causes, or I probably will, but if I mention causes that can be sort of controversial, please be sure that they are controversial. Be sure that we don't have, we're not 100% confident about what causes what over such a long period of a transition of inequality and trends of inequality. So I begin with this slide. This slide is a work that has been done by a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Pedro Souza. He's very recently received the prize on this work. It's actually an extension of a previous work we have done from 1928 to 2014. He extended that to 1926 to 2014 or 15, if I'm not wrong. And this is what the story of inequality of Brazil tells us. This is based on tax income data, and therefore it focuses on the top incomes because only richer people pay income taxes. And these black dots here are Brazil. And these are the dots for France, Sweden, and the United States. They're all mixed up most of the time. And let me begin with the story of the US, because this is very emblematic for the discussion I want to take. Those triangles, they are the US. So what we begin with is that the US, France, and to some extent Sweden had almost the same, and Brazil had almost the same levels of inequality back in 1926, which is the beginning of the years, but around the 1920s. They had almost the same levels of inequality. And something happened. So these countries diverged for some reason. This is data from Piketty and others, and this is a well-known story. Well, the main argument is that there's a series of structural factors such as a war plus a control of wages and so on and so forth that made inequality decline in Sweden, the United States, and France, and many other countries as well. And among them, a tax system that emphasized a lot the taxes on income taxes. And those factors, they kept inequality low for a very long period. But the story in Brazil is different. Something didn't happen that caused what we call the great leveling. Something happened that didn't let the inequality in Brazil go down. And actually it goes up during the Second World War. And we believe that this is happening because of two things. First is the improvement of the collection of taxes. So these are tax data, and they reflect the improvements in the tax collection. But also, this is a period that while the countries that entered the war, clearly entered the war, Brazil entered the war as well, Brazil was an ally, But while the countries that entered the war as mostly combatants and sending large amounts of troops and really had the war mobilization that Brazil didn't have, they imposed a series of regulations in their economies. Brazil didn't impose it, and actually it was profiting from the war because it was a provider of raw materials, and a series of sectors in the Brazilian economy were profiting from the war, and that caused inequality to go up. That's possibly one of the major explanation. And this easy period in Brazil is living in a democracy. In 1945, Brazil had a change, and it became a dictatorship, the Vargas dictatorship. And so 1945. Before 1945, Brazil was a dictatorship, and then inequality is going up. For some reason, after the war, Brazil is no longer a dictatorship, and inequality starts declining. Well, the conventional explanation for the behavior of inequality at this time is essentially a Cousin's explanation that says, well, the more a country industrializes, the more inequality grows up to a certain point. After that, inequality will decline. Well, we see the opposite. This is a period of very fast growth in the Brazilian economy, and also the period of impressive industrialization compared to other Latin American countries. The Brazilian GDP, industrial GDP, the share of the GDP in industry, in manufacturing, goes from something like 10% in this period, of 10 to 20%, it goes up to 40%, 50% in maybe less than 10, 20 years. And inequality declines systematically until 1964. It never fell to the levels of the US, Sweden, and France, even though it started from about the same levels, but never fell so low. And possibly because it didn't have the same factors behind it, it possibly didn't have the regulations of the economy that they were present during the time of the war. But this point marks an abrupt change in trends. Inequality is declining, and suddenly it increases rapidly without precedent. I mean, except for the time of war, inequality never increased so rapidly. And why this is happening? 1964 is the year of the military coup that installed a dictatorship in Brazil. The important point is not only the dictatorship. The important point is that a dictatorship suppresses all the possible mechanisms that could control inequality and make inequality go down. And actually, one of the explicit objectives of the dictatorship was to concentrate income, guided by the idea that income concentration would lead to faster growth. And indeed, it led to faster growth. The economy of Brazil was growing at the current Chinese rates, so rates that went up so high as 11, maybe 13%, depending on the way we measure it. And so concentration was successful, perhaps in the sense that it was promoting growth. But it's not about only concentrating incomes. It's about removing all possible ways of reducing inequality. For instance, unions were forbidden in this period, and all possible types of collective civil associations were also forbidden, and a series of measures to increase investment were actually like reducing taxes for apply to capital and increasing taxes for labor, so you could use those resources for promoting growth. You used an exchange rate that would favor, of course, you want to do import substitution, so you use an exchange rate that would favor some certain groups, especially the richer groups of the population, and also because you have very fast economic growth, so that creates conditions for income concentration. This goes very well until the 1974, when we have an oil shock, the oil crisis. Not the oil crisis only, but it's a series of factors after that as well, especially an increase of interest rates in the US. But essentially this means that all the conditions, the external conditions favorable for the Brazilian growth, including credit, were cut suddenly, and that led to a collapse of the Brazilian economy. Not really a recession, but a collapse in terms of previous growth could not be sustained, and the economy started slowing down. and with consequence for the next decade. So between 1975 to almost 1985, which is this period here, the economy is beginning to stagnate, and it gets completely stagnated at the beginning of the 1980s. And actually, the economy enters a recession in 1985, which is the end of the dictatorship, possibly related to the Great Recession we had in 1985, that simply convinced the people that dictatorship was unsustainable, and the model of dictatorship was understood as a cost that had economic growth as a benefit. Because the dictatorship was no longer delivering high growth, the costs were surpassing the benefits. So there was a series of movement. And then Brazil enters again in a phase of a democratic phase. Not really, because the 1985s, from 1985 to 1994, a very important characteristic of the Brazilian economy is hyperinflation with a huge instability and stagnation of the economy. So you have a combination of no growth and hyperinflation, and we don't really know what's happening here with inequality. Even though we have the data, this can be many different factors because of hyperinflation. We're talking about at least 100% a month of hyperinflation here, so it's too hard to measure what is really happening here. But we used to believe that this was a period of increase in inequality, perhaps related to hyperinflation. And then for some reason, we got good data again in 1994. And 1994 is a very important year because this is the year when Brazil re-stabilized the economy, and the inflation rates went to what we consider normal inflation rates, 5% a year, 6% a year. I think the first years it was a little higher, but they're still below 10% a year. And it is a period in which we begin to see a decline in inequality in the labor market, using labor market surveys. We see a systematic, even though people talk a lot about the Lula's government decline of inequality, a decline in the labor market begins somewhere around 1995, between maybe 1996, but we see the first signs of decline in inequality in this period. And then looking at tax data, we see a certain level of stability, especially between 1995 to the beginning of 2000s. We don't have very good tax data, because this is a period in which when tax data started to be processed by computers systematically and stored in computers and not really made public. So we don't really know what happened here. The data we have here is very poor. But again, we do have data from 2006 to 2012, and what this data tells us is that the inequality remains stable between 2006 and 2012. And this is high quality data. Well, not high quality data. It's just the best tax data we can have. Is this important? The answer is yes, it is. And the reason is because all the surveys, all the household surveys were showing a decline in inequality. A decline that was increased after Lula took power in 2003, but actually the decline began in 2001, possibly in 2000. We don't know, because 2000 is a year where Brazil runs a census, and in census years we don't have a household survey data that's fully comparable. But anyway, myself included, I had a paper that was trying to explain the causes of decline of inequality, the determinants of the decline of inequality in Brazil. And then we had access to this data, and when we recalculate the levels of inequality using tax data, we saw a stability. And this is stability, what we see here, as opposed to what we thought that was happening during the Lula's government. And let me show you another one. Well, before I talk about a little bit more about the present period, let me talk about Brazil in comparison to other countries. I was comparing them with developing countries before, but now I'm comparing them with other developing countries. In this case, it was Argentina, Colombia, and South Africa. And what we see here is also Argentina, Colombia, and, Colombia is over here. So Argentina and Brazil departing from about the same level. Also South Africa, the triangles here, about more or less the same levels of inequality in the beginning that we would find in the US, in France, and and Sweden and other countries in Europe as well. And in those countries, in developed countries, you see a decline of inequality. You see the great leveling. In developing countries, you don't see the great leveling. So possibly there's something that didn't let inequality go down at that time that responds for part of the high levels of inequality you find in South American countries and also in South Africa, Colombia also, but we have very recent data for Colombia. But interestingly is that even though we can explain part of the Brazilian history by idiosyncratic factors of the Brazilian history, you see that Argentina and Brazil are kind of dancing together. They move together over a very long period until a point in which we don't have data for Argentina. And of course, in the more recent periods, they detach from each other. They're fully decoupled. And you also see this happening in South Africa. You know, when inequality goes up in Brazil with a little lag, it goes up as well in South Africa. So as I said, we have more questions than answers. We don't really know what's going on here, because it can't be the war, because it's 1947 or something, and inequality is going up in South Africa. So it must be something else we don't really know. Could be a larger global movement of industrialization, and industrialization brings a certain structure in the economy, and that economy can respond either for a higher or lower inequality. We don't really know this. And again, what you see is that for some reason inequality in South Africa went down, and then suddenly we measure it going up. We don't know how much of this is data. It could be, but it's impressive that inequality goes, increases so fast in South Africa. And frankly, I am not a specialist in South Africa to attempt any possible explanation to this. Some people has criticized this, saying, well, this is a period in which you have apartheid in South Africa. This is a period where we don't have it anymore. And inequality during apartheid must have been higher than the period where you don't have it. And the answer is, well, not really, because what we measure here is concentration at the very top. And not necessarily apartheid would result in kind of lower concentration at the top. It could result, of course, in high levels of poverty or high levels of different distribution of the middle of the distribution, but not at the very top. Well, so far I've been showing data using only tax data, results based only on tax data. But I also have results based on a combination of tax data and survey data, so we can measure what's happening at the entire economy or the entire distribution of incomes, including the bottom. And what we see is, again, very much the same story. Inequality was very high in 1975, 1976 is the first year we have data, so in 1976, not 5. 1976, we see very high levels of inequality, and it doesn't matter what we're doing here. We're just attempting different types of correction. We're correcting only the very top of the distribution. We correct then only the top 1% of the distribution, also the top 10%. It really doesn't matter. It's more a test. But what matters here is that we see inequality going very high, and then around 1995, we see a decline that begins in inequality. So when we include the bottom of the distribution, the decline is more clear, and it begins much before the Lula's government. That's an important point, because most of the literature so far has been associating the decline of Brazilian inequality with something that happened after 2000, but actually we see signs of decline before that. But this is the household survey without any corrections. We see a steady decline over the years until 2015, when we use survey data only. But when we add the tax data, we no longer see the decline, we see almost an stability of inequality. And this is something that surprised me included. As I said, I was writing a paper of the causes of the decline of inequality in Brazil when we first had access to this tax data, and I had to throw this paper away, of course, because we saw an stability of incomes, not a decline. What is behind this stability of incomes? Essentially, household surveys measure very well labor incomes, but they're very poor in terms of measuring any sort of capital incomes. They're not designed to do that, and for a series of reasons. And tax data, on the other hand, measures fairly well capital incomes, and this is because either capital in Brazil is taxed at source and profits are not taxed on incomes. Sources are taxed on the company. Individuals are not taxed on the distribution of profits and dividends. And so why inequality was being kept stable? We see here that the white one is labor. We see that the contribution to inequality of labor is declining, and that reflects what we see in the surveys. Labor income inequality is declining, and therefore it's pushing inequality as a whole down. But on the other hand, the contribution of capital to inequality is increasing. So essentially what's going on here is that while we saw a decline in labor inequality as measured by the household surveys, we had an increase in the concentration of incomes based on an increase of an increasing contribution of capital incomes to inequality. Well, what's behind this inequality? This is the composition of the top 1% of the income distribution in Brazil. Labor and pensions respond for about 46%, and this could be considered like labor incomes. Pensions are even though they're an investment somehow, given the type of pension system Brazil has, we can perhaps think of this as which is pay as you go. We can think of this as labor incomes, and they respond for less than half of the incomes of the top of the distribution. Then we have profits, which are a mix of capital and labor incomes, because it responds in part for the work of entrepreneurs, but also for the remuneration of their capital. And of course, we have capital gains and investment. And capital gains respond to a very large share of incomes. 9% is a lot for capital gains. In capital gains, we have two things inside it. One is profits coming from the stock market that are distributed as capital gains, but also remuneration or gains from buying and selling property, usually houses and other types of property. That's Those incomes are highly concentrated. Capital incomes are highly concentrated. 80% of the capital gains are earned by 1% of the population. Something around 73% of all profits also earned by 1% of the population. A lower level of financial investments. I mean, not the 1%. This is within the top 10%. And why we're measuring within the top 10%? Because there are almost no capital gains below 10%. That's why. So that's why labor and pensions have such a low share. The actual share in the total population is, of course, much higher than this. But within the top 10%, 80% of the gains, which means almost 80% of the gains in the entire population, will be earned by 1% of the population, and then we go. So we're talking about something very concentrated. So it's no surprise that a small change in the amount of capital gains and also in the concentration of capital gains can drastically alter the levels of inequality. So far we have been measuring this until 2015, a mix of tax and survey data. We do have tax data until 2016. We don't have it after 2018. We first taxed, I think we do now, perhaps the last month or so, we have data for 2017. But what I want to call your attention is that if you, let me go back two things here. You see that we have a decline that begins in 1995, around 1995, and remains steady until 2015. So we have 2 decades of decline on inequalities. Something happened in the middle of the way that in 2015 we have a total shift, and we have a steady increase in inequality since 2015. Inequality in Brazil is increasing as measured by the survey data. I believe that we would have the same results if we're measuring this using tax data. But inequality was declining until 2015 and begins increasing after 2015. And the key for this is that we had a huge recession between 2014 and 2015. Of course, it's a huge change in the economy. It's no surprise that the trends of inequality would be changing, but they actually could be changing into any direction. They could be actually inequality could be declining, not increasing. But the reason for the increasing of inequalities, that is actually the type of recovery that we see in the Brazilian economy after the 2014-15 recession. And this is how the economy is growing. Essentially, this is a curve that shows that between 2012 and 2015, the poor were growing at very faster rates than the rich. And everybody was growing. Everybody was above zero, so the entire economy was growing, and everybody was in the poor were growing faster. So we had a pro-poor growth. And what happens after the recession, after 2015, is that actually the rich are growing, and the poor are being left behind. So the reason for inequality increasing in Brazil is that the type of recovery of the current recession, Brazil is still stagnated, is a pro-rich growth. So the rich are recovering, the poor are being left behind. And I don't have the, let's see if I don't have, no, I don't have a graph here, but this could be reduced if the Brazilian social network was actually working as it's supposed to be working. During a period of the recession, you're supposed to open your network of protection. And actually, Brazil didn't do this. Actually, Brazil is receding the networks, is reducing the network, is closing the network. And programs such as Bolsa Família, the cash transfers, is actually the number of beneficiaries of Bolsa Família is being reduced. The values that Bolsa Família transfers also have been reduced. And the eligibility criteria also has been reduced, meaning that you have to be even poorer to have access to Bolsa Família. So one thing that you could do to at least reduce this problem here, Brazil is not doing. That is introduce social assistance and social protection in general to keep the economy going. What kept this group not falling? Well, this is essentially, this is individual incomes, but we also have this for family incomes. And what is keeping some family incomes from falling even more is the pension system and also public employment. Whenever people are, the sectors, when you calculate the distribution of incomes, take into consideration the pensions and also take into consideration the sectors where people work, we see that we observe almost no decline in public sector work, which of course, because they're being protected, the wages are not being reduced. But we do see a huge decline in the informal sector and most of the private sector, especially civil construction and in manufacturing. Well, this is the story of changes in trends in inequality. And as I said, I have many more questions than I have answers. I don't really have answers for all this. What I see is that there are very little chances that Brazil will be a country with low inequality within maybe the next 5 decades or 4 decades. We did calculations of what would happen if Brazil, for instance, could promote a huge educational reform to the point that everybody would have access to secondary education, or at least everybody would have, even if everybody had access to university education. We even simulated what would happen if everybody had a PhD. Every single worker in the Brazilian economy had a PhD. And we take demographic inertia into consideration when we do this. And even if in the 1990s, in the 1994, when the period Brazil stabilized completely the economy and possibly inequality began declining, even then, if we had promoted a huge educational reform that was able to put we're able to put every single Brazilian in school at that time and ensure that they would leave school with a minimum of secondary education, that would reduce inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient in 2 percentage points only. Even if we had the entire Brazilian labor force with a degree on teachers training and pedagogy and related courses, that would reduce inequality about 8% in total. So even if we're capable of having every single Brazilian worker having the equivalent in wages of a PhD, the educational equivalent in wages of a PhD, that would reduce the Brazilian inequality in the labor market only in 18 percentage points. That means Brazil, even if Brazil was much more educated than France, Brazil would not be as equal as France. So I don't see a very positive perspective in the future for inequality. First, I don't see a positive perspective for inequality reduction, and there are no signs of a change on these patterns. And also, we don't have the political signs of a change in these patterns. We don't have political conditions, given that Lula's government was much more against inequality than, of course, than Bolsonaro's government. And also, I don't see the conventional tools for inequality reduction, such as investing in education, as an investment with high return, at least in the short and medium terms. Maybe if the Brazilians invested a little bit more in other types of tools, including regulating a little bit more the labor market, which is not simple to do, and also changing the way incomes are taxed, we could have a small reduction in inequality. But also, I would not be very positive regarding that. We simulated what would happen if profits and dividends were taxed the same way as wages, which is the norm in the rest of the world. And that would reduce, this is a simple reform in the sense that it doesn't require a huge change in the tax system. It can be changed by a law. But still, the changes caused by a measure like that would be around 2, maybe 3 percentage points in the total levels of inequality, which are not huge changes given the very high levels of inequality in Brazil. Maybe I spoke much more than I should, so I better stop here.
Thank you. You know, we've had a lot of very interesting presentations and panels in the Bildner series over the last 6 months or a year. And they all have a very depressing message to convey, which maybe some of you will be able, or Marcelo may be able to point to some silver linings in the cloud. But the message, and you're not the only one, that is, we've had particularly political scientists and economists that have pointed this way. So I will open it up to questions. In the Bildner, those of you who are new to Bildner panels, we take 3 questions at a time, which forces our respondent to take notes, and then respond to them in bunches of 3. But maybe this one will take 4, because I'm going to take the opportunity of asking one first. And that is, I'd like you to elaborate on the factors that would prevent Brazil from getting significant improvements in inequality towards, say, the French level, when you are hypothesizing tax reforms that would tax capital gains and profits at the same level as labor, and when you're hypothesizing a labor force that has significantly higher levels of education than we do now. That is, what are the mechanisms that hold back that kind of motion toward equality, since there was under Lula, and you noted that it came even a couple of years before Lula, an improvement in equality. So now I'll take 3 questions, having abused the prerogative of the chair, and ask one first. And let me ask you to identify yourselves as you ask your question. Yes, please.
My name is Brian Ford. A long time ago, I was a political science student. I studied Brazil at that point, but it's a long time ago. But, at that point, we were asking questions about neoliberalism and its effects. This was in the early 90s. But My question is whether you're asking the right question, because I do work on education reform now, and I look at inequality and I was thinking, about 5 years ago, when I was writing, I was saying, gee, most of the world is getting more unequal. And the exceptions were pretty much in Latin America, and Brazil was a principal exception. So, I mean, the question might be, why was it an exception at that time, as opposed, this is not the aberration. The aberration when inequality was lessening, not when it was increasing. That would be my general comment. And there were some what factors contributed to it then, and was it an aberration as opposed to something that you could have? It could have a prolonged trajectory of reducing inequality.
Sure.
Thank you. Next question. Yes, here, please identify yourself. Stand so everybody can hear you.
Hi, my name is Natalia. I'm an artist and activist of the Defend Democracy in Brazil community. Just following a little bit your question, but asking, because maybe I missed in the presentation, but was there a percentage of that inequality decrease that you described during the Lula years or the preceding years that led to 2012 when it started to go up again? Because that's in more plain terms, as an activist, it does really seem that we were living a dream and that we fell from the bed. And I just wanted to know if that's just an impression as a member of society, or if there are actual facts or data that support that.
And yes, please stand or speak loud and identify yourself.
Speak loud. Yeah, my name is Vito Chavarria. I'm a journalist with Cuban Standard in Miami. My question is very simple. How come there's no chart showing what is considered lower income, middle income, and upper income in Brazil?
Okay, so there we have 3 questions, or 3 plus mine. So Marcelo, do you want to stand and use the computer here? Because you may want to point to some of your graphs.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for all the questions. Maybe I should start with the easiest one. I didn't bring the chart with the levels of income, absolute levels of income, just because I thought it would be too much. But yeah, we can have, you can calculate this for the entire distribution, so it's not very hard to. And compared to the US, it would be much lower.
Right.
So the top 1% of the US is about 4 times higher than the cutoff for the top 1% of the US is about 4 times higher than the cutoff for the Brazilian levels of income. So, but anyway, and of course the levels of poverty are also much higher. Even though Brazil insists in using a poverty line that applies to Mozambique, the Brazilian economy is not Mozambique, but Brazil still uses the same poverty lines that apply to Mozambique. That's essentially political, I think. But anyway, let me make a comment that maybe addresses all the concerns at once. And one way you're putting, or the question that Kent has put to me is, what should we do to make Brazil become a France in terms of inequality? And that's essentially a funny way of putting the question. And I can answer this with another question. What should we do to to make Brazil become a France in terms of GDP? What should we do to make Brazil grow the same way that, in a way that is going to make the Brazilian GDP reach the GDP of France? And the answer is, of course, I don't know. And so the answer for the question, what should we do to make Brazil become a France of inequalities, also, I don't know. I have no idea. And we do have some idea of what could improve or reduce the levels of inequality in Brazil. But most of the evidence we have, and every time we try to simulate something in that area, we don't arrive at the conclusion that we meaning Brazilians, we could become France. And I don't want to be over pessimistic here, but I remember, I like very much a sentence of Walter Scheidel that maybe to reduce inequality to those levels, we have to call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse for a ride. This war, pestilence, because that's his argument. It's the story of the history of declines of inequality are somehow associated to war, to pestilence, or whatever. The 4 horsemen of when they ride, the economy falls. Not always. Sometimes they ride, and the inequality increases, but it only really declines when they are writing. So maybe this is bad news in the sense that, at least me, I was used to the idea that democracy could perhaps reduce inequality, and so. And I come to my second point here. Because perhaps this idea that democracy could be a factor to reduce inequality, and I still think it can be, because all the declines we see declines in inequality during democratic periods, and increases in inequality during dictatorships. And so this is a dictatorship, inequality increasing. Democracy, then exactly at this point, the dictatorship again, and then a transition, and then democracy, and false. It doesn't false, you can see it better here. This is democracy, beginning here, 1985, okay, there you go. This is democracy, inequality decline. So there is something here. There may be a political explanation to the behaviors of inequality. There may, a theory of inequality should include, to some extent, politics. But that said, the conventional explanation for the very important increase in inequality we had, the conventional explanation for this increase in inequality here, actually we had data from 1960, a census here, and another census in 1970, and the dictatorship begins in 1964. So the conventional explanation was based on human capital theory. That explains, of course, the behaviors of the behavioral labor market. It wouldn't explain anything happening in the distribution of capital incomes. But actually, we finally found data that had not been used at the time. We had access to data, first, the tax data year by year, but also we had access to surveys that had not been used at that time. They were stored in a library, and this data is showing us that the effect of education that was supposed to be the main cause of the increase of inequality during the 60s to 70s actually didn't happen until 1968. Most of the inequality increased between the beginning of the dictatorship, 1964, and 1969. And 1964 to 1968 is a period of either recession or stagnation in the Brazilian economy. So the conventional human capital explanation cannot apply to a case like this. You could explain the behavior of the economy after 1968, when the economy starts growing at a very fast pace, and of course the demand for labor increases, the demand for qualified labor. So that could be an explanation after that period. But even then, we now have also access to the data that have not been used yet, but data from 1968 to 1974. And this data is also not showing education as the major cause of the increase of inequality. It is one of the causes of increase in inequality, but not the major cause. The major cause is what we cannot measure, the residuals. But I think it has a specific meaning, and frankly, I don't have a theory capable of explaining what's going on. I wish I had. Maybe you should sit again or stand here. I don't know what I should do. Maybe I stay here.
Stand there, and I'll recognize questions here. No, but I can just, blinding by the screen there. But we'll take another series of questions. But I'm going to make one other observation, coming back to the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And it is that I saw an article, and I think it was written by a Brazilian, but I don't know if I could go back and find it, that made the argument that when Western countries were confronting the Soviet Union and communism with a superpower behind it, there was a dynamic toward creating equality so that the communist message, creating less inequality, because the communist message of equality was something that Western capitalist countries were trying to avoid. Since I think it was a Brazilian who wrote that, are you familiar with that?
Actually, we're working on that again.
So hold that for a second. Let me take a couple more questions, and then we'll see. So I shouldn't, but if it's a follow-up question that relates, yes, but otherwise.
Yeah, of course. What is, I guess my question here is tax collection in Brazil. Are there any issues with that in terms of tax evasion? In other words, the wealthy 1% or whomever, are they able to evade taxes a lot more readily than even here in the United States? Is that a real problem?
That's a good question. Yes, please identify yourself and speak loud.
My name is Tracy. I'm an illustrator, but I've lived in Brazil and South Africa at different times in my life. And I was just curious whether the informal economy, which perhaps does not get taxed, is taken into consideration, because I guess I lived in South Africa just after apartheid, and I lived in Brazil just after the dictatorship went down, and I've been back a lot. So where does it figure, all these Uber drivers or maybe people just selling things on the street? What is there? Are they included in these charts in any way?
Sure.
These last two questions relate. And one last question back there. Identify yourself.
My name is Guilherme Minelli. I'm a sociologist. And I was wondering if you have any data comparing Brazil and Chile, since our Ministry of Economy takes Chile as the whole example of economy in Brazil, like for this.
So go ahead, Marcelo.
So those are very easy to answer. Yeah, well, the answer is no, we don't have any. I don't have any data here comparing Brazil and Chile, but that can be easily compared. There's a lot of data available, and especially in terms of household surveys. There are some attempts to measure inequality and correct the household surveys using tax data in Chile, and I think they can only make those corrections from 2012 on. I don't think they can go back in time as we did, but still, there's a lot of this work being done on this, and I think that there is some data available. I better not speak much about Chile, but and again, the technical things. Yeah. Yes, we do have data. This data includes the informal sector, and technically there is no reason to believe that we're not actually collecting the data. Of course, we're collecting this data imperfectly. There are some problems to collect data on informal sectors, but I would say that most of the incomes of the informal sector are being somehow captured here, to the extent that we capture labor incomes in general. And we also believe that there is tax evasion in Brazil, of course, but the Brazilian tax system is designed in such a way that there are very little incentives to evade, because you don't tax profits and dividends. So in those taxes, the taxation happens at the corporate level. So you don't tax dividends and profits.
No capital gains tax.
Capital gains you do tax, so you may evade them, even though they can be hard to evade because they're related to property taxes and transfers that happen in the stock market that are very hard to evade because you have to declare that they're controlled. Yeah. And in the case of transfers of property, like real estate property, you also have to register them, otherwise you're not the owner of the house you bought or you sold. So it's I believe there is evasion, but not really to the point of concerning us. Regarding this, the type of evasion that I think that can exist is that Brazilians may have property outside of Brazil and that is not being declared. But that's a different.
For example,
in Panama, like in Panama Papers and so on. They can have property in Manhattan, in the U.S. or in Delaware or whatever. They can do different types of things, and that's not going to be declared. So, but then there is very little we can do about this. Almost nothing we can do about this. And there was this paper that Andrea did this paper first, that he showed that the closer we were from the Soviet Union, the less inequality you would have in the country. And he comes up with this. We're not working on this. We're trying to work on this on different types of political problems. But the paper you mentioned I didn't take part on that yet. And the idea is that Europe is essentially, social democracy in Europe is a reaction or a prevention to communism. Essentially, that's the basic idea. The fear of a potential revolution would make the European countries accept more openly social democrat ideas. And that's essentially that. Yeah, I like it very much. I don't know if this is how good this is, but anyway, it is. That's what the results show. There could be other mechanisms that we're not taking into consideration. Should I sit? Should I stay?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me, one technical question. When you said that the income of the informal sector could be captured, is that through the household surveys?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
then, no,
Not the tax data, yeah.
So there is a way of getting at that.
Yeah.
And at what level do people pay income tax in Brazil? That is many of
The
at
top
bottom-
10% only. The top 10% only of the population. Only the top 10% of the population pays income taxes. Yeah.
So, and how much percent?
Well, more people than that pay income taxes at the source when they, receive their wages, but this is
Did they
small
file
amount.
returns? Yeah, I
Only
remember I
10%
was
of the
in,
population file returns. Only the top 10.
I was in Brazil in the 1980s when they would have, I've forgotten what the date is when the taxes
Yeah.
due, like April 1st or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
And they would show a picture of the lion, the lion is
Yeah.
the image of the tax authorities. And so you would have this giant paw with claws sticking out of it, and you, the taxpayers, figures you've got to pay it. But in fact, those TV ads were aimed only at the top 10% of income earners in the country.
Yeah.
Good.
And I should remind you that to belong to the top 10%, you don't need a very high income in Brazil. Something like $2,000 put you in a month, put you certainly in the top 10%.
So let's take another round of questions. Mauricio, you first.
$1,000.
Loud.
Sorry for my throat.
Sure, absolutely.
And Mauricio has a sore throat. I've got a cold sore throat, so we need to be quiet so we can
That
hear it.
1996 spike,
Oh, that's
you call that spike and you say that that's a random or a measurement problem.
yeah.
Actually, it looks very impressive. Without that outlier,
Yeah.
it would look a lot better at democracy.
Sure.
So my
It's much
question
better.
is that a problem of measurement?
Oh, the spike probably is a problem, but the other points, I don't think so. They can be a result from hyperinflation.
That's my point, which is it doesn't look that bad. You can take that spike out
Sure, it goes down.
and it's more even.
Yeah, very even. Yeah, I agree with you entirely.
So,
The other question,
Go ahead.
if I may, how would this hold up at the level of regions in Brazil, Nordeste, South, South, São Paulo, race groups?
so region and race, which are to some degree overlapping categories too. So, other questions? Yes, please. Identify yourself. Speak loud.
Hi, my name is Edson Cadet, and I'm a journalist for Afropress.com in Brazil. My question to the professor is, what is the impact of the legacy of slavery in Brazil affecting that? And when you talk about inequality in Brazil, how come you don't say the inequality between blacks and whites in your chart?
Sure.
Additional questions? Yes, again, please. Loud.
All right, so I'm going to make this, it's sort of a comment on the Soviet part of it, that, this idea of class compromise, I think Przeworski is the best person to look for on this. But the other element besides the collapse of the Soviet Union was the fact that global communications were such that you no longer had to form a national-based bourgeoisie. You could, it's a little bit different from Brazil, because Brazil is a different world.
Yeah.
It's so removed from other ways. But you can, instead of having, national bourgeoisies, they would want to make sure that they had labor peace, because labor unrest is very costly. It's just that comment. Yeah.
Interesting comment. Any other last questions? Yes, please.
My name is Mary Paisley. I was just wondering if the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers led to any prosecutions of Brazilians for tax evasion.
Okay. The answer is no.
So, go ahead, Marcelo.
Well, so far we're talking about general levels of inequality, the population taken as a whole, without taking into consideration any type of disaggregation of this. But when you disaggregate, then results start showing different scenarios. First, when we disaggregate by regions, it depends on the period. We cannot disaggregate by regions before 1976, because this is when we start having the survey data. So it's hard to tell what happened before this, before 1976, and I don't really know. I just think that there can be a concentration in the same period that inequality increased. I think there would be a concentration in regional terms, and essentially because this is a period of industrialization in the region of São Paulo and Rio. So that can be highly concentrated. And same thing here. Though the industries are being benefited in Brazil are essentially industries being benefited in the southeast of the country, which are Rio and São Paulo again. So I think this also was a period of concentration, but we don't really know. Not this, I'm sorry, this one. Yeah, after that, we do have a very high levels of regional inequalities that compared to the US are like in the scale of 10 times higher. And to the point that some Brazilians once mentioned that Brazil was Belindia. One part of Brazil was Belgium in terms of income, the other part was India in terms of income, and that in the 1970s meant that part of it was really poor and the other part was really rich. And those inequalities, they persist. Sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down. I don't know exactly what happened in the last 5 or 10 years, but there was no convergence as expected. Some people say, now one day, regions will converge, and because the theory says so, because it's a unified market, so the market will converge because people will migrate, industries will migrate, and that actually never happened. Then you can also disaggregate by gender, race, and disability, which no one mentioned, but I do have some data on disability as well. The data on disability we have is very poor, because we have this only for 2 data points in the 2 censuses. So I'm going to discuss more the evolution of racial and gender inequalities in Brazil, because I think they are more like, we can discuss evolution in better terms. And we start having, of course, we always had data on gender inequalities since we had the surveys. Before this, it's only men, before 1976, essentially we have men paying taxes, because that's the way the economy was until 1960s and something. Women enter the labor market. Women were always in the labor market in Brazil. Can I raise this a little bit? Yeah. Okay. Women were always in the labor market in Brazil. That's something that people don't fully understand. The levels of participation of women back in the 1850s and during the slavery time were very high because women were slaves. They were working. So labor market participation was very high in Brazil. Female labor market participation was very high. It declined after slavery was banned. But it really didn't fully decline until maybe, we don't know it very well. I have a colleague and I working with this data now. We're trying to figure out how to measure these things because we only have like one data point every 30 years. But we believe that participation decreased after slavery was banned, and then started increasing again in the 1970s. And we do have more data on women participating in the labor market, and therefore income inequality after the 1970s. And of course, it is declining since the 1980s and 95s. For 95 on, I'm sure that it's declining, but it's declining at a very slow pace. And it's declining much less than we should expect, because since women are participating more and more in the labor market, the idea is that the more they participate, the more they will occupy better occupations, the more they have occupy better positions. So the initial expectation was that gender inequality would reduce. But what Juliana actually found, that Juliana is over here, and she was a student of mine, and what she found is that most of gender inequality in Brazil is concentrated at the top of the distribution. So the reason for which inequality is not declining is that women are not reaching the higher positions in the labor market. As if, that's my words, not her words, but as if there was a glass ceiling that cannot go through. And am I right? Or okay, I'm good, thank you. And I like the work very much. So, and actually should go back working on that. But she's not my student anymore, so I cannot give her orders. So I have to ask, please, Juliana, maybe we should. And also, we do have some data on racial inequalities beginning in 1984. And the reason for this is that the military believed that Brazil was a racial democracy, and therefore we should not collect data on race, because there's no racial inequality in a racial democracy. Well, we're going to talk about something we're going to talk about a problem we don't have. So in 1984, they started collecting data, and what we see is a huge discrepancy between essentially what we call blacks and whites. Black is a category. Brazil is a highly miscegenated population. So we classify, if we count people as black. Black is a division because Brazilians don't identify them by ethnicity; they identify themselves by color. And black is a great group that is composed by anyone who is not white, essentially. So anyone who's mixed or anyone who is fully 100% black, like, you know. And this group responds for about half of the population, which is different from the US, that I think blacks would respond for something like 8% of the population, maybe 12% of the population, I'm sorry, that. And in Brazil, they would respond for something like 9% of the population, blacks, strictly speaking. But that does not make a difference, because when we calculate all the differentials, browns and blacks, which is actually all the mixed people and blacks, including Brazilian Indians or indigenous peoples, they would compose about half of the population. The differences in wages of this half of the population and the rest of the whites are amazing compared even to the US levels, which are considered extremely high. So Brazil does have a very important problem of racial inequality. Some people say, well, no, but this is not an inheritance of slavery. And then I come to your question. This is simply because they have lower education. So it is an indirect effect of slavery because they came from families. It's a problem of social mobility. They came from families that didn't have high levels of education because they were slaves, and they kept having low levels of education. This is propagating from family to family. And so, well, that is not true. Because first, slavery was banned three generations ago. So if you had corrections, this should be corrected. Second, I have a colleague who made a series of calculations simulating what would happen with a person that this person was born in a white family. This black person was born in a white family. And the answer is that this person will be still in a much lower position in the distribution of incomes. Meaning that there is a heavy weight of slavery in the Brazilian society, but there is still something operating now. It's not only a historical problem. I'm emphasizing there is an important historical problem, but there's also a very current problem that is not being correctly addressed. And interestingly, when I made the simulations of what we could do with education, well, if we made this impressive reform of putting every single Brazilian in the labor market, having at least secondary education, and the current level is only 30%. So I'm just almost doubling the levels. And I compare that to the equivalent of reducing gender and racial inequality in Brazil only to half of its current level. Half would be still very high, but I'm reducing gender inequality. And this would have the approximate effect of universalizing secondary school in Brazil. So this gives us a benchmark of how important racial inequalities are. It's as important as universalizing secondary school, gender and racial inequalities. I don't know if I answered the question.
Good, thank you. A next round or follow-ups on some of these questions. One follow-up, the perspective going forward is one that's somewhat discouraging. You've talked about pro-poor growth and pro-rich growth, and those are a result of policies. So could one go back, what would be the measures, and is there a practicable ability to implement them, of creating pro-poor growth again in Brazil? But let me see, are there other questions that, yes, please, Lau.
Well, let's go back to the horses of the apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
For some of us, I'm Carmen Rial, I'm an anthropologist and professor at the University of Santa Catarina. For some of us, the horses of the apocalypse are already running free in the country. And you've said that the political has an impact on inequality. So what can you see as a future with Bolsonaro's politics? And also, we read that there is a huge transformation, technological transformation that's about to come in the world. How this technological transformation would impact inequality in Brazil?
Another follow-up question? There was one. Go ahead.
I just wanted to go on the aberration question I brought up before, because I know if you look at the United States, inequality goes down until about 1970, plateaus, and then starts going up. When I brought it up before saying Brazil was just a world to its own, I think that the extent to which you have transnational investor classes instead of national investor classes is mitigated by the fact of natural resources.
Sure.
Like a country like Brazil,
Yeah.
splitting up the natural resources makes sense, so that it's less likely to do that. But I still like the period in which Brazil has this decline in inequality from 1985 to, I guess, 2015, so 30 years. It's a long period with that spike in it. It's still, it is against, world standards, where, basically between countries, inequality went down, but within almost every other country, inequality went up, but not in Brazil.
And not as the rest of South America as well.
It was, not Chile, it went up.
Yeah,
certainly,
Chile was an exception.
I know that there were some countries that did and some countries that didn't, but it was interesting because South America, and not Latin America, but South America was the only part of the world where that was true when I was looking at this 5 years ago, 6 years ago. So, why is it different from the rest of the world?
And let me just add one more last question here. Since we talked about race a little earlier, and Brazil has experimented in a number of places with different types of affirmative action for education. Are there data to show the impact of that on income inequality and things like that?
How do we create pro-poor growth? This is like $1 million question because we don't really know, but I can assure you one thing. This is a long-run perspective. Pro-poor growth involves investing in things that will increase the activity, the economic activity of those at the bottom of the distribution. This is hard to do. But even though it is hard to do, it's possible to do because we do have lots of experiences of countries doing that. But in the case of Brazil, I think it has to do with mobilizing low-skilled workers into activities they can get into. Agriculture is no longer an option because agriculture is not, agriculture for food is too important in Brazil as a labor, as a demand for labor, but export-oriented agriculture is entirely mechanized, so they're not going to incorporate lots of low-skilled labor on that. What will incorporate that is services and civil construction. And in those two cases, in the case of civil construction, it's very clear that public investment can have a role in that. It depends on the way you do it, because depending on the way you invest your money in civil constructions, you can build, highly sophisticated and use no labor for that, or you can actually use large amounts of labor. It depends on a series of things. People think that habitation will be a type of investment, that housing essentially will be a type of investment that would promote some level of pro-poor growth, which is not so hard because levels of income of the poor or the lower strata of the distribution are so low that almost anything can increase very much their income. So the second thing is that, is there any perspective of recovery or any perspective of pro-poor growth, or if not pro-poor growth, of a reduction of the poverty? Poverty is increasing in Brazil as well. Is there any perspective of not having poverty increasing? And the answer is no, because it's not so much the government, Bolsonaro's government. Bolsonaro is part of it. But even if you take Bolsonaro and put someone else, the problem is that the policies are essentially austerity policies. They refuse to increase, to some extent they have some type of prejudice against social systems and any types of social protection. And this means that in the short run, it's almost impossible to keep poverty at least stable, not to mention to avoid it to increase. So I don't have any positive perspectives on that. And the question of the exceptionality, abnormality here, I think that why inequality in most South American countries, with some very well-known exceptions, declined over the years. One thing is because many of these countries adopted policies that were not in place before. They adopted, I'm not only mentioning the social assistance policy, they were important. It's much more than that. It's an entire way of looking at your policies and say, well, my policies should be benefiting the poor, they're not pro-growth policies, they are pro-people policies in that sense, they should be benefiting. So I would include the social assistance, of course, but also include all the types of policies you do in your general economy, in your general economic policy that would benefit the rest. But the other explanation is that inequality was so high, the Gini coefficient was around 75. Inequality was so high that it was impossible to increase. Inequality went to a point that it was simply impossible. The only way you could go was down. So I think one of the reasons it kept stable over time and went down because it couldn't go anywhere else. It could be either stable but not go up. Oh, the affirmative action. The results we have are that affirmative action is not expected to have an important impact, immediate impact on the income distribution. And why? First, because of the demographic inertia. Affirmative actions in Brazil are to include essentially blacks and students from public schools in the university system. And by doing that, you just educated the bottom of your labor force pyramid. They're very young people that are entering the labor market. Until they become a majority, it's going to take a long time. So there is a demographic inertia that holds the effects for over years. But second, the idea of affirmative action is not to reduce inequality, is to create a black elite in Brazil that can serve as either a symbolic example, also as a political elite that can take forward policy that would benefit ethnic minorities in general. And so one of the ideas of affirmative action was to break this glass ceiling by creating a black elite.
In that regard, since we have a woman anthropologist from Brazil and a woman former student of yours from Brazil, is academia different? Since I have a lot of Brazilian friends who are professors in academia in Brazil, and of course they are civil servants, like I, CUNY professor, and a civil servant as well. There's a limit simply in choosing that profession, but I'm wondering, is there significantly greater equality in, at least for women in the universities? I'll add one more thing. I taught a course at the USP, University of São Paulo, in 94 or thereabouts, and I did have one black student, but he was African, not Brazilian.
Sure. Yeah, which is one is my personal opinion, my personal feelings, and my anecdotal experiences, and the other one is data. Data shows that the participation of women in high university level occupations is increasing because the levels of education of women are increasing very fastly. Actually, in terms of primary schooling, women are better than men. Girls are better than boys. So I think that in the future we're going to see changes. Those changes are, in my view, slower than they should, and essentially they're being held by economic demographic inertia. But there are mechanisms that are still in place that hold women back. If they're not. I don't think that the correct term would be a glass ceiling. Maybe it would be some sort of a drag. They can go up. There's just something that slows them down going up. That said, that's what data says. But I am a sociologist, and I work at the Department of Sociology. And of course, sociologists are not very prone to gender discrimination, not to mention racial discrimination. So there is, but much less than in other places. So I don't see much difference. And I can tell you, she is a woman, and she was one of my best students by far. So I think they are occupying. If they have not occupied it yet, they will occupy it very soon. And perhaps not in terms of equality, but in much better terms than we have today. But that said, in the Department of Sociology, which is supposed to be a department totally open, we only have 2 black teachers out of 30 teachers. We have like half women and half men, but only 2 black teachers. And I think this will change, of course, over time, but still, if there is also, again, a drag or maybe a glass ceiling, whatever, name it as you wish, that impedes them to go above the master's and PhD levels that you would require to get into the university system, which is very negative because black students don't have like something to mirror it. They don't have an image that they can use as a reference of I can do that, like like a black president or a black whatever, and stars and so on. Yeah.
Last chance. Okay, thank you very much, Marcelo. Thank you, the audience, for coming. Thank